Okay then, clip 2. We ended clip 1 by coming up with these key questions or inquiry questions or hypotheses or whatever Edexcel want to call them, which changes as much as the wind changes direction. And we got those questions from somewhere. We looked at the title, we thought about the terminology, and we must have had an idea of what actually happens to depth and width and discharge and gradient and so on and so forth. Well, this is where we got our idea from. These are 2 bits of what we call geographical theory. So when you studied rivers, you should have looked at both of these things. The long and the cross profile, long, how it changes from source to mouth, basically gets flatter. You should also have looked at Bradshaw's model. Okay, this is basically saying what people have found out about a river, and you can see from the arrows that, you know, depth increases downstream, width increases downstream, so should velocity, discharge and so on. These things here should get smaller. Okay, so that is our kind of context of what we looked at in terms of geographical theory. You might get asked about, what geographical theory did you use? How did this help you? Well, it's going to help you almost put a framework on your investigation, and it doesn't really matter what you're investigating. If I was investigating effects of vaping, for example, I'd obviously start with, well, what's the current research saying? What are the current theories about these activities saying? So it's no different to any kind of scientific investigation. I see what's already been published, what work's already been done, and I'm kind of almost, if you like, testing this theory. You know, we're looking at width and depth. Does it increase? Does it do what Bradshaw's model and what the long profile says it should do? Or does it behave in a totally different way? The second thing to think about in terms of background is this idea of, I'm going to go and investigate this river. I should really know where it is. I should really have some idea of location, and I should really have some idea of background information. We did this for you. We produced you this document that's probably somewhere in your Rivers book that's buried under a pile of dirty washing or something. But it basically tells you and shows you where Church Stretton is, where Carding Valley is, and what it's actually like. So the sort of nest of maps we've got here, we start with the United Kingdom, we sort of gradually build up in terms of scale, West Midlands Standard Region, the counties within the standard region of the West Midlands. You know, there's us in Sandwell. We went over to Shropshire. Okay, we then, and I'm just going to swap maps slightly, that's a more detailed map of Shropshire. We were here at a place called Church Stretton, which is I'm not quite sure I'd call it a village, a small market town. And then finally, the OS map, the incredibly detailed map that shows us where Church Stretton is, and you can see marked on here Carding Mill Valley. That's the stream that we were actually measuring. There's a V for the visitor centre, there's a P for where Brian parked the coach, and we were, you know, just situated just outside of Church Stretton. How are maps useful? Well, not only are they going to help us locate where we actually are, but they might actually provide clues as to what's going on. You know, I know this is not a brilliant copy, but there's lots and lots of contour lines on this. It can help us work out where we're going to measure. It can show us maybe something about the area, whether it's human or physical. You can see from this that this stream has not a lot of human activity until you get into Church Stretton. Okay, you can see that there's lots and lots of other little streams dotted all around. That's suggesting that, you know, that the drainage basin's got a very, very high density of streams. Further locational information was provided with a site map. So when we actually get to Carding Mill Valley, you can see this one is not to scale, we looked at where we were going to get our information from, the different sites that we were going to have to actually get in the river. Okay, so number 1 was above the waterfall, number 2 was the confluence, 3 by the rock slide, 4 just down past the coaches, and 5 by the entrance. Ideally, that's not a huge number of sites. If I could do 8 or 9 or 10 sites, I would do. But the other thing to think about with location and site suitability is, well, can I drive there in a day? Can I get from Wednesbury in the West Midlands to Church Stretton and back in a day and get some data? You know, I'm sure there's lots of other really good rivers up in Derbyshire, over in Northumberland, but there's just no physical way that we can get there in a day. The logistics of what we've got to do constrain what we can do. Okay? Going back to the place itself, we've got a little bit of geological information that this was covered in ice. The ice retreated. You've then got vertical erosion cutting down from these streams. We know it's an area of outstanding natural beauty. We know it's governed by the National Trust. So we've got a bit of background to the area of study. Now, I'm going back to my silly vaping example. If I was going to investigate the effects of vaping, I'd want to know all about vaping. I'd want to know some kind of background research to what it was, where's it come from, how long it's been around, before I tried to do any kind of investigation. And we're just following that very, very similar principle. Our sites are where we go in and where we collect the data. And we'd have to think about the suitability of those sites, okay? I know you didn't choose them. So if you get a question about what made the site suitable, for goodness sake, don't write anything daft like Mrs. Buchanan chose them, I didn't. Okay? Pretend you chose them. What makes them suitable? Well, they're close together. They're within walking distance. They're going to show us changes. They're easily accessible. You know, we're on public property here. All right, we had to book it, we had to speak nicely to the National Trust, but the land is open to the public. It's not private property, so we've not got any of those hassles of permission or anything like that. You could all get in the stream, if you're wearing appropriate shoes, fairly easily. You know, I didn't, sort of find a site that had got a 10-foot drop and just throw you off the edge and say, there you go, get in and measure that. There are lots and lots of things that make the site suitable. From a logistical point of view, there's somewhere to park the coach, there's a visitor centre, there's a first aider in the warden's office, which we have actually used in the past, there's toilets, there is accessibility in terms of people with visual impairment or disability, probably up until about point number 3. I think when you get to the confluence and beyond, accessibility isn't good. Okay? But for somebody of reasonable fitness, yes, all right, you'll be out of breath by the time you get to the top, and it's probably the most exercise you've ever done in your Wood Green Academy career, but most ordinary people are able to get to the top and back. Would I take Year 7 or Year 8? No. I wouldn't say this is a suitable, or sites aren't suitable for those children. I would say upper school, sixth form, adults, most adults, it's suitable. Okay? And that question of suitability has got different aspects to it. Logistical suitability, we start at number 1, we work downwards. Doesn't make much sense in starting at number 5, going to number 3, going to number 4, going to number 1. It's equal, well, not quite equidistant, but it's a walkable distance. But there's also aspects of logistical suitability, public access, etc., and the other things that I've talked about. The last bit of background that you've really, you've got to be aware of. They could well ask you about risk assessments and what risks there are on field work and what have you done to mitigate these risks. Now, obviously, you haven't got to write a risk assessment, which I have the joyous task of doing. It's about a 16-page document that takes me hours and hours and hours and hours, where I write about stupid things like make sure they've done up their shoelaces. But the exam board want you to have an awareness of what are the risks involved in field work. Now, I would always go with physical field work, top 3 risks. My top risk is always lost pupil. That doesn't matter where I go, whether it's urban, whether it's rural, whether it's a theme park. My top risk is always losing a pupil. Now, that's not because I would lose my job over it, but actually I've never lost a pupil in 25 years of teaching. Think about what we do. Think about how we make that as low risk as possible, because I think it is low risk. the severity of it. If I put high risk on a risk assessment, I'd never be allowed to take a toenail beyond the school gates. So by managing or using control measures, I make that low risk. So think about it, it's dead easy. It sounds stupid, but it works. We take registers, we do regular head counts, we have a member of staff at the front, we have a member of staff at the middle, we have a member of staff at the back. We overstaff it so that if something does happen and somebody falls over because they've got daft shoes on, we've got a spare member of staff that can take them back down to the visitor centre. If we've got somebody with limited disability, limited accessibility problem, we're taking kids in wheelchairs, we're taking kids with visual impairment, we take an extra member of staff to go with them, okay? We break into small groups, you're never left on your own. So the chances of you getting lost are incredibly low because we've taken these control measures or mitigation measures, okay? Second highest risk, I think, for outdoor physical field work is always the weather. Probably because of where we are. So, for example, the preceding week before the trip, I've kept an eye on what BBC Weather's saying for Church Stretton. On the morning of the trip, I've kept an eye on what it's saying for the day at Church Stretton. And generally, BBC Weather is incredibly accurate. If it says it's going to rain at 12, it's going to rain at 12. Now, clearly, if I looked in the morning and saw, well, it's going to be torrential rain all day with the possibility of thunderstorms, you would have to call that trip and say, no, we can't do that. You obviously have to amend what you do because the weather is never certain. So one year we went, it was incredibly cold. We knew it was going to be incredibly cold. We got to a point where we thought, no, actually it's too cold, and we called it, and we didn't get to the top. We stopped at about a third of the way up and went back into the visitor centre to warm up. You can't control the weather, but you can look at what's happening and almost try and work round, or mitigate would be a really, really good word to use, mitigate these problems. I wouldn't say that would be the same for somewhere like the urban fieldwork. I don't think the weather is such a big factor, or for Shrewsbury if I was going to Shrewsbury with Year 9, but I do think it is particular to Carding Mill. Third risk, trips and falls. It's outdoors, it's classed as a medium difficulty climb. From the way some of you lot walk up a hill, I don't think you've ever walked up a hill before, and some of your inability to walk on a footpath never ceases to amaze me. It does get a bit rocky, it does get a bit, you're out in the wild, but I wouldn't say we're sort of in complete wilderness like we're Bear Grylls. But we do have people fall over. Now, the reasons that they fall over are generally because they're wearing silly shoes. So on the letter, it says about, you must wear sensible shoes. We do actually look at your feet in the morning, and if we deem them highly inappropriate, we would have to say you're not going. So if you're going to turn up with, 6-inch stilettos on, the chances are you're not going to get on my fieldwork bus. We walk in single file. We have a first aid kit. We've always got members of staff that are first aid trained. Again, it kind of links with this one. I'd have to sort of think about the weather. If it was particularly rainy and damp and slippy when we were there, we may not go to the top, or what we've done in the past is we've taken the more hardy members of our brethren up to the top of the waterfall and left the people who are generally moaning about how much they've walked all day down at the bottom. So, we do get people fall over occasionally. Nothing serious to date has happened because of mitigation. Okay? So I'd also be aware in that background section of risk assessment. You might be given somebody else's fieldwork, you could be asked about the risks, you could be asked about their site suitability from the information you've been given, and this is a really good example of apply what you know. What did we do? Because we did it properly. What can you remember about our risk assessment, our site suitability, that you could then use to look at what somebody else has done? Anyway, next clip will be a bit more, what's the word I'm after? A bit more practical. We'll be looking at bits of fieldwork equipment, and then eventually we'll be going out and filming. There we go. Done.